what does systemic racism mean, and what does it mean particularly in education? And we ended up really thinking about what are asset-based approaches to education, because those seem to us to be one strategy for at least beginning to dismantle what we consider to be systemic racism. And that led us again to who are the students who are not really seeing early college as the best solution for them and for their future, and that is young men of color. What we think about is early college as a strategy to dismantle deficit thinking. You probably all know what that is, but that is thinking that students are to blame for their poor academic performance, not unfair systems. And thus an asset-based approach focuses on students' strengths. And that's really what we think that we're trying to do with early college. An asset-based or strengths-based approach views diversity in thought, culture, and other such traits as positive assets. And then I think more complicated, when we think about education systems that are based on assets, then we have a lot of work to do to change systems. And we see early college as able to do that in some modest but important ways. So why we think early college is an example of an asset-based approach. So instead of beginning with what young people of color can't do, we're beginning with the dreams that their families have for them. You can go to college. In fact, you're going to start college right now. We're removing at least part of the worry about cost because the college credits are free. And the more you accomplish, the less you'll have to pay to complete your degree. So that takes away a bit of a family worry. Finally, we accelerate students rather than remediating them. One of the worst aspects of a deficit-based approach is repeating and repeating things that are simple-minded and that don't challenge. So early college has said, you're going to go faster, you're going to do better because we know you can. And finally, you all are responsible for creating community that's supportive and connecting with each other, with the students, and helping them connect with peers. So here is the issue. Somehow we are not welcoming, supporting, and retaining young men of color the way we are with young women. So you can see here, 65% female, 35% male. And when we get to community college, you'll see that the numbers that Pam Eddinger tells you about community college are not hugely different from this. It's a national problem, a universal one at many levels of education.
I'm Michael Collins. I'm vice president at JFF, and historically I've done a lot of work in post-secondary policy and systems change, and more recently I'm leading a body of work across the organization and JFF partners on racial equity and economic equity. And it's terrific to be with you today, and I think that this conversation is an important one because we need all the strategies that we can to improve outcomes for this population, and particularly men of color. We have an amazing wealth of knowledge in the panelists today, and we want to jump right in. I'm not going to do formal introductions. There's bio material, and I really encourage you to read it to see the breadth and depth that the panelists will come at this issue from. We're going to, as Nancy said, tackle a question and a follow-up, and then in succession, and then we'll come back to a question around advice. So I'm going to start with my colleague, Greg. The question, why are young men of color important populations to focus on? And what are the education trends you're seeing with young men of color, both positive and negative?
So thank you, Nancy and Michael, for grounding the conversation. I think the easy answer for one is why are young men of color an important population to focus on is sort of in the name of equity. But beyond sort of the obvious easy answer is that poverty, structural racism, and maladaptive coping of young men in many ways robs us, society, of the brilliance, the potential, and the full civic participation of boys and young men of color. And it's and we have a selfish interest in removing, limiting, and fighting against the barriers that prevent them from contributing to us. So I think one, it's the right thing to do, but the other is that we benefit directly when men and boys of color are fully allowed to be their brilliant selves and participate in society. Uh, some of the trends that we're seeing is a greater emphasis on mentoring and modeling, and the general idea is that in order to be it, you have to see it. Greater opportunity to relate to teachers and faculty of color. Greater opportunities to to see and understand yourself in the future. Um, but one of the challenges with that is, how do systems reward particularly minority faculty that are serving as mentors, or teachers that are serving as mentors, in terms of how is that work both recognized and rewarded in a compensation system or in an advancement system, was some of the things that we struggled with, particularly in a traditional four-year college, where faculty of color were expected to do the diversity work. However, the diversity work was not rewarded as a system. One of the other things that we're seeing in this call or conference is a testament to it: greater attention and discussion around assets, and less focus on deficit perspectives. But also a more of a emphasis on context, and where our students are coming from. And in some respects, it's not that there's a push for you to for for secondary ed or post-secondary ed to understand it, but to acknowledge that your experience is not the normative experience. And we can say more about that. Just interesting enough, and I'll close here. Was having a conversation with my supervisor just around sort of work, stress engagement, and coping, sort of as a grown, mature adult professional, and saying like, hey, this moment is hard. But also recognizing that where I come from is different than my white male supervisor. In that there was a article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about a week ago. One in four Philadelphians know someone that died of COVID. Nearly 50% of Philadelphians have had their income adversely impacted. So, even as if my supervisor was to normalize his experience as my experience, there wouldn't be room to, one, address sort of my needs, or understand what it is that I'm going through to support me in doing optimal work. And I think that we are now at a point where we are decentering sort of middle class white experiences as the norm, and opening ourselves up to the fact that there are other experiences. And in the absence of sort of opening up to the fact that your students can have other experiences that you may not share, we are limited in the way that we can provide supports. I'll stop there and pass off to my colleagues.
Thank you so much. We're going to hear from Amanda. I was mentioning some of the outcomes for Black men. These issues and disparities are also seen for the Latinx population, Native American population, Amanda brings a wealth of knowledge, and we're going to hear from her on the same questions.
I do come to the education space with the focus on Latino representation in education, because at the core of our work, we believe that the assets are so strong of the Latino community that our role is to help elevate, amplify, and ensure that Latinos are well represented from the schoolhouse to the state house, because we believe that has direct impact on outcomes for Latino children and all children. So with that, in terms of why are men of color, young men of color, so important for us to focus on, I'll speak more from the Latino lens, although a lot of what I'll say is, as Michael just said, exists in all of our communities of boys of color. With that said, let's put into perspective that Boston's growth since 1980 has been fueled by the Latino population growth. And in fact, I believe that you can attribute all of the population growth in Boston to Latinos in the last 20 or so years. So at this point, we make up about 20% of the representation of the city of Boston. We know that 1 in 4 school children are Latino, and then about 40+% are Latino in Boston public schools, as an example. But we know that in many of our gateway cities, those percentages are even greater, such as Lawrence and Springfield, Holyoke, et cetera. So with that, what the whole point of that is to say that we are emerging as a Latino community as a very important sector of the workforce. And we are a critical workforce of the future. So when we think about jobs for the future and what JFF does, well, who's going to fill those roles? It's Latinos and other people of color. So when we say why it's so important to the Commonwealth, if you just want to look at demography because you don't want to deal with the racial issues that exist in our Commonwealth, that should be enough of a case to say this is why this is so important, this focus on young men of color. So along with that, I do want to say a little bit more about the slide that was posted regarding the much higher rates of girls pursuing higher ed than boys, and certainly that's very persistent in the Latino community, where that's been the case for quite a while. It's very interesting from a sort of cultural perspective that we're seeing Latinas really breaking down the barriers and sort of really seeing for themselves college as a pathway, much more than Latino males are able to see themselves pursuing that path, as you've heard. And yet, some studies have shown that Latino males, 85% of Latino males or Latinos think college does provide a better pathway. They have positive beliefs about what the opportunities are of college, and yet they're not pursuing it. Some of that is cultural. Some of it is cultural in that unfortunately, and I say unfortunately as a feminist Latina, that doesn't always go together, but in our culture, but one where boys play a role of working and being the breadwinners, right? And some of that still does persist in the community. So when I talk about solutions, I'm going to talk about the role of families and how important they are. So that is just a reality. And then again, as has been spoken about, we unfortunately see males of color in our education system through the prism of a school to prison pipeline, and that is the pathway for far too many boys of color. Latino students are 3 times more likely to be suspended, expelled, and referred to the criminal justice system. 3 times relative to their white peers that may commit the same quote infraction. So this is pretty scary stuff when you think about these norms that exist in our schools, about our negative perceptions that exist in the education system toward young men in particular. So when we perpetuate those beliefs about young men, it obviously will show up in their academic achievement. And when we know that, for example, that 8th grade math proficiency is a strong predictor of future success, and not a single English language learner in Massachusetts has been able to achieve advanced on the MCAS, this is a real problem. On the 10th grade MCAS, despite much smaller percentages of enrollment, more white students achieved advanced than Black or Latino students combined. So these unfortunate sort of negative and deficit ways of thinking about our students do persist in the education system. So we have a lot of opportunity to work collectively toward addressing some of these challenges. Now, relative to the trends, um, we know what's positive is that an educated Latino community is positive for the Commonwealth. So that is a positive. If we decide to say that having 2 languages is an asset to the Commonwealth. And so there's a framing that needs to happen, or reframing that needs to happen around how we think about language, dual language, and bilingualism as a massive asset to the Commonwealth that we should be trying to elevate and instill into our boys in particular about what that asset is that they can bring to the world and to their own promise and future. I think that some of the positive things that will support some of the work that needs to be done around racial equity are around the recent Chapter 70 and equitable funding that was finally passed through the legislature to close the funding gaps for our schools that need it the most across the Commonwealth. That was a really positive sign and indication of where the Commonwealth is headed. That is very positive, where the resources will be going to the students that really need them. Of course, the pandemic has impacted that significantly, which is really unfortunate. We don't know where it's going to go, but at a minimum, I think we can at least say that the mindset shift has happened, and that's really important. I think the 2 other things I'll mention, and I'll then turn it over to Pam, uh, is with COVID right now. This is the time for experimentation. There are a number of community-based organizations that are doing learning pods, who are rethinking what role can we all play in educational transformation during this time to address these system level disparities that are affecting our boys. The last thing I'll say is, as a positive, is the focus on diverse teacher and leader pipeline, which I think, as we heard from Greg, that important aspect of having teachers and leaders and folks in the school building that reflect our communities. There's a real commitment to that I haven't seen before at the state level, and just real earnest effort to better collaborate and work toward achieving that common goal.
We're going to go over to the Bunker Hill. So I would like to hear from Pam and Nuri. Same questions: why are young men of color important populations to focus on, and what are the education trends you're seeing, both positive and negative? And
Okay.
Pam, are you starting? Over to Pam.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. Thank you, and I'm glad to see everybody around the table, a lot of good friends, and conspirers. I think we need a lot of conspirators to get this done. Nuri and I have been a tag team lately. Nuri is the actual architect and implementer of our early college initiative with the support of huge financial support from the Smith Family Foundation, Marjorie's Shop. Those of you who are familiar with the landscape. But the other thing that I think it's important for me to say is that Nuri is heading up with a number of colleagues an initiative on campus called HOPE, Halting Oppressive Pathways in Education. I got that right this time, Nuri. And what it really does is it focuses on Black and brown males on our campus. And I get this question all the time. Why are we focusing on that? Why isn't everybody's lives just as matter as Black lives or brown lives or male lives in this case? Because our houses are burning. All houses are important, but this house is burning, and it's burning to the ground. And if you don't put out the fire in this one house, every other house is going to burn. So when I get questions like, well, why are Black and brown men and boys important? It shows me the level of inquiry that we're at as a society, that we actually have to ask that question, right? If you substitute the word Black and brown with white, would you ever ask that question of anyone who lives in the United States? But that's my outrage, right? So I'm going to pack that outrage away for the breakout, because I think it's important to hear about the barriers that Nuri has to overcome in order to build an early college system that moves the numbers. And I think this one does move the numbers. So Nuri, why don't you take the mic?
Thank you, Pam, and thank you for the outrage, because I think it is absolutely necessary. I struggled a bit with this question myself, because I came to the same sort of point of outrage. My answer is, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we focus on this population? If we claim that we believe in equity, if we claim to be educators, then we must have this focus. We have a moral imperative. Brown versus the Board of Education happened in 1954. That was 60 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, and we're now over 60 years past Brown versus the Board of Education, and we've gone from fighting separate but equal to integrated but inequitable. So we have this moral imperative to do this work, to keep this house from burning, as Pam said, and to finally do it right. But beyond the moral imperative, as our colleague Greg said earlier, our city, our state, our nation needs the talents and the contributions of Black and Latino males. We're depriving ourselves of progress and of prosperity by not allowing the gems that lie latent within all of these students to really shine through. So we are doing ourselves a disservice by not doing the incredibly difficult work that we have before us to transform, to allow this particular population of our students that we are bound by duty, in my opinion, to serve, to be able to thrive. So we have to do this work. So my answer to this question is that we must. So in terms of trends, the good news is that we're seeing young men of color who are in fact participating in early college. That's a really good thing. When they do really well. But the bad news, as we know, is that the rates of participation overall are low. And so this is the challenge that we have come to, is why is this happening? And these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Why is this happening? Why are we not seeing men of color participating at the same rates as other students? And part of this is because, as I said, we haven't done this hard work yet of transforming ourselves as individuals and our institutions into spaces that are welcoming to this student population. We have this set of opportunities that students are sort of aware exist, but they're not accessing them. We're not presenting these opportunities to students in a way that they find attractive. So we, as the educators in the room, think that we understand, but it's free, but it's college, and if you go to college, then you can have all of these opportunities, and it makes all kinds of logical sense to us. We understand, we can connect the dots, but everything that we're saying sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher to a lot of our students. Blah, 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 jobs, blah, 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 pathways, blah, 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 blah. So we have to learn to speak a different language. We have to learn to present the opportunity to our students in a way where they can hear and understand us and where it is actually valuable to them. But not only that, we have to create the relationships with our students where they want to listen to us. And those relationships are incredibly important for Black and Latino students in particular. If we haven't forged those relationships, we can have all the opportunities in the world, but our students are not going to take advantage of them. They're not going to engage with them. They're not going to hear what it is that we have to say. So in many cases, part of the reason that the relationships aren't there is because students are not seeing faculty and staff who look like them, who are sharing these opportunities. That is another area where we still have so much work to do, but we haven't also done the work to make teaching and education appealing to Black and Latino males as a profession. So that's like, there's so many layers to what we need to do. The solution to all of this is not simple and is not quick, unfortunately. It means deep, deep work and transformation of our institutions and of ourselves. So, I really just wanted to leave it with that point of, but one of the things that I'll say about the Hope Initiative at Bunker Hill is that we began with the premise that we have to do a couple of things simultaneously. One, we have to acknowledge and very clearly in all of our language communicate that the reason that our students are not thriving is because we have created inequitable systems. That our systems of education were not created for the success of men of color. They just weren't. And so until we change them, we're still going to see different outcomes for different students. And we need to say that, and we need to say it clearly, and we need to communicate it to our students so that our students understand that this is not their fault, that this is our fault. This is our work we have to change, we have to do. At the same time, we can't wait for maybe 400 more years of work to transform the racist systems that we've created, right? We have students in front of us right now that need the educational opportunities that we have. And so right now we have to help those students to also navigate a system that was not set up for them. And so that's sort of the framework that Hope has operated on, is to do the deep work of professional development and engagement to be able to transform our institution and to ask the right kinds of questions, while simultaneously working with our students to help them to navigate a system that we acknowledge was not set up for their success. And that's a really sort of hard proposition to balance, but that's what we have undertaken.
All right, so to wrap up then, our tag team here is that as a college president, even in as beautiful a microcosm that Bunker Hill is, and we're really trying to perfect a microcosm within an institution as an example of how it can be done, we're battling the same things that you're battling. When we bring up these issues, there will inevitably be 3 people who says to me, Pam, why are you talking about race again? Inevitably, every time. But it's okay, because if they're aware that we're talking about it, eventually they'll hear what the narrative needs to be. So while Nuri and Steve Pruden, who's also on this call, is running like crazy people to build the structure of Hope and build the structure of the early college, I'm running like crazy to try to make sure that we build the culture within the college that holds the early college work, that holds the Hope work, or whatever other work that we're going to do. So your job as a college president or as a leadership team is to recognize it, tell the story with the folks, and fund it, and make sure that the funding is stable. I don't care if it's $20. You got to make sure that the $20 is there over and over and over again, because like Nuri says, it's been 65 years, right? About 63 years since the Board of Education, Brown versus the Board of Education, and it's going to take another 60 years. So having patience, and without jumping from project to project, you stay with the project and you hope that the project takes root. So that's my work as the college president, is to till the soil, really, for these things to grow. It's complicated, Michael. There is no one answer.
And so I'm going to go back to my colleague, Greg. Greg, the last question, what are you seeing that's working, and, what advice do you have? And we'll turn the mic to you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I also want to say that I approach this work as someone that flunked out my freshman year of college because I had no idea. I knew about the idea of college, but had a very limited understanding about the culture of college. And so, as one that studies race and masculinity, it's very important for us, one, to sort of understand what it means to engage in help-seeking behavior from a racial standpoint, but also understand what it means for males to ask for help, ask for directions, or to admit that they don't know. Sort of the pathology of masculinity, if you will. And one of the things that I've 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 experienced was normalizing uh, help seeking, and under also having allies in the classroom or help seeking offices. So think tutoring, writing center, that made it a point to make help seeking normal, and not in a mission of, oh, the black kid just doesn't know how to write, or we got another unprepared kid here that blah, blah. So this whole taking the deficit perspective off of help seeking, or understanding that a barrier to help seeking may be masculinity, but also not wanting to reaffirm racialized stereotypes. So engaging in that whole act of, hey, I don't understand, let me go to this center, it happens within a racial context that my very act might affirm my worthiness to be there. So I think that those that are providing support need to be aware of that dynamic there. Um, Also, as a professor at the College of New Jersey, working with boys, quote unquote, boys that just didn't get it, it was important for me as I trained pre-service teachers to get pre-service teachers to see the value of these boys. So we would have these boys come to campus, and they would be experts for 2 class days around adolescent learning and development. So we would actually flip the classroom. So the people that traditionally needed help are now the resource providers. And so I would also look for opportunities for your communities that need help. Where are opportunities for them to be resource providers? Where are opportunities for them to offer all of their value, what they know, what they understand, to also be seen in the community as not just people in need of help or people in need of support, but also a source of support. Uh, Identity matters in the ways that we construct both the context of education, but also removing barriers around reaffirming negative identities that are associated with stigmatized groups. And so I think the more that we can make help seeking and help providing one in the same, throughout this life, you will be both perpetually, and to the degree that we can normalize that, I think that we can address some of these issues. um, and I'll just say this, and then I'll be quiet. It was actually Nancy that took me to the writing center, and maybe this was 1991, after I flunked out of school, and basically said, "You wouldn't know this, but all of the rich white kids go here too." While I was at Penn, I worked in the tutoring and learning center. One of the things that amazed me as a grad student was there was what was called an old exam file for the Wharton School of Business. Everybody knows Wharton is one of the most prestigious business schools, but students were able to come to the old exam file and get every single freaking exam that had ever been given at Wharton to study. And that just blew my mind around what support could look like, and the lengths that institutions would go to ensure that folks had every opportunity to succeed. And from my cultural orientation, working in groups was cheating. and looking at old exams. That was cheating. That was stacking the deck. And here I'm seeing like, yo, stacking the deck of success is built into the cake of the most prestigious institutions. And I say to you, in terms of advice, stack the deck.
Amanda, if we could go to you, what are you working and what advice do you have for the group? Thank you.
So I'm going to take this question from the lens of the work that I do more generally around education, that I think can be sort of coming more from the advice perspective. But there's some that are just very practical that that we've noticed in the sort of K through 12 experience for kids, that I think uh, translate to advice that would work in this context. And one of those things is around family engagement and knowing how important the role of Latino families are in college, sort of the college going mentality and perceptions of accessibility. And so we know how important it is for families to get a lot of clarity around the um, accessibility of college and all the options that there are. And I would presume that many of you are already doing work along these lines in terms of even recruiting young people to be part of the early college program. But to the extent that the family is equally as engaged in that decision, and then the kinds of supports and the training that families might need to provide family support, that is equally important in sort of any educational setting. And then just something that's pretty basic, but that we have found to be really inconsistent across school districts in the Commonwealth, um, is sort of translated materials and communication that's available for Spanish speaking parents. And that being done in an authentic way. So not having and having materials that are not Google translated, for example, that you share with families whose first language may not be English. This is very important as sort of that kind of interaction with families that you may have. And so that falls into the family engagement sort of thinking that is required, I think, relative to a college going mentality and ongoing support. Um, it's been talked about before, but any time we can provide role models and mentors who share the backgrounds of our students, this is really a key of being able to be what they can see. And I think along with that is the deep work of identity. So our work in our fellowships is focused on rising leaders in education, but they're folks with about 3 to 7 years of experience working in education. And we also experience sort of a higher percentage of females versus males in our programming. But one thing that we've learned is that while those individuals who go through our programs have made it, right? They went to college, they have professional jobs, but when they go through the deep work of actually thinking about their history, their experience, and their own schooling, um, reconciling family that they've left behind because they do have an education. These issues are not dealt with at the sort of high school level for kids, and I think it could go a long way to support initiatives that allow males to be deep in these conversations about identity, because if you don't do it, then it's going to stay with them throughout their higher ed and in their early professional lives in particular. So I think the sooner we can get at that, the better. And doing that also affirms their culture, their history, and their aspirations. So that's and then the last thing I'll say is, um, as I said earlier, we have um, both at the third grade and eighth grade as sort of these tipping points in education where the path can substantially deviate for young men of color in terms of their academic success and outlook. And so my wondering around advice or opportunities is, what is the role of elementary and even middle school of this? What is the role this group plays in sort of paying attention to even earlier in the pipeline, especially at that eighth grade level where the formation of ideas for young men of color is the strongest in terms of their ability to see whether there is a pathway for them to higher ed or a professional pathway for them. So I think that's the middle school grades are really important to pay attention to as well.
Coming back to the Hope Initiative, which we have been working to connect to our early college work. I just wanted to give a couple of examples of what we have done in Hope that we have seen to be successful. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and this is not unique to the Hope Initiative, this is something that we've been doing across Bunker Hill as a whole, is really digging into the work of using cultural wealth as a framework and really trying to understand that all of the different aspects of self that our students bring to our classrooms and to our institutions have incredible value, but we don't always see that. We might see some of it sometimes. I think, often one of the easiest ones for us to see is language ability. And so if students can speak more than one language, we'll see that as an asset. But we don't see a lot of the other aspects of their cultures that they bring to the table as being an asset. And we need to learn how to do that. We really need to do that internal work. So as part of that, in the Hope Initiative, one of the things that we did was to think about our own use of language and how we communicate with students as part of the work that we needed to do to transform ourselves. And so, in community college in general, we often find that students will earn a really significant number of credits, but won't necessarily graduate right away. So we might see students who hit a threshold of, say, 45 credits, but they're not quite there for graduation yet. And so when we do outreach to those students, we might say something like, oh, you have all these credits, but you still have to take more before you can graduate, or which is not exciting for anyone to hear, really. Or, you have all these credits, but sorry, most of them aren't quite for your major yet, which is really discouraging. Nobody wants to hear that. So when we did outreach last spring, actually it was in the fall for the spring semester, to a group of students who were all Black or Latino males who had earned 45 credits or more. Instead of communicating to them, ooh, you have 45 credits, but you're still really far from graduation, instead, we sent them a letter that came from me. So it was a letter from the dean, which apparently people either find terrifying or exciting. And so they received a letter from me. And the first thing that it said to them was, congratulations. You have earned 45 college credits. Wow. That is spectacular. That is amazing. We want to celebrate the fact that you did that. You did that. You earned 45 college credits. Let's celebrate your success. And we didn't mention how close they were or were not to graduation. We didn't talk about any of those things. We just said we want to celebrate you. And we're inviting you to come to a special celebration where we'll also have some advisors present who can help you think through what your next steps might be. And all of the advisors who were present at that special advising session were themselves Black or Latino men. What we found was that a lot of students actually showed up at this celebration and special advising session. A lot of times we send out invitations to these kinds of things and one or two students show up. We had a lot of students show up and we were really surprised that so many came. Not only did we have a lot of students show up, we had students show up with their entire families. Their whole families came because they were so proud of their students earning 45 credits and getting a letter from the dean. And I tell this story a lot because it hit me very deeply about how important language is and how important it is for us to reframe our thinking about what our students can do and have done. And just by changing our language away from something that sounds punitive, we were able to really attract students to come in and talk with us and to feel good about themselves. The result of that was that for that group of students, we had about 80% who persisted into the next semester, who actually registered and came and studied with us in the next semester. A comparison group of the general Bunker Hill student population was about 68% of students persisted that semester. So we know it worked. We know that it worked. The looks on our students' faces when they came into this event told us enough, but the data also shows that this can work. But it really requires us to rethink how we reach out to students and to do so in a way where they can truly hear us.